This is a story about an important piece of American history. It's about a dynamic, fire-breathing, steam-belching, hot, sooty, sweaty piece of iron. You're about to ride the rails on America's most beautiful steam-powered locomotive. This is where the iron meets the road. Pound for pound, the most talked about, revered engine in all of steam railroading. Hop aboard and ride the rails on what was once America's freedom train. This is the 4449, the Daylight. In the early years, steam engines were almost always painted black. Many were built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. Their bright red number badges stood out against the jet black boilers. At first, the early boilers were fired by wood. But that soon became impractical as the railroads crossed the open grassy plains of the nation's heartland, where forests weren't nearby. Some engines were converted to coal, others to oil. But like the Challenger from the Union Pacific line, these engines were still painted black for practicality. As time progressed, payloads increased, and so did the size of the engines. Southern Pacific 2472 pulled the longest passenger train route in America, from Sparks, Nevada, east to Ogden, Utah. Her giant drive wheels stood taller than the average man. But in the late 1930s, Southern Pacific Railroad decided to give their new passenger service that ran from San Francisco to Los Angeles a facelift. They called it the Daylight because during the long days of summer, it made the trip from San Francisco to Los Angeles during the daylight hours. And this is where our story begins. In the late 1930s, America was still in the throes of the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 had been followed by years of drought in America's heartland. The Dust Bowl wiped out entire family homesteads. Often with nothing more than the shirt on their back, these beleaguered refugees headed for the golden state of California, there to begin a new life. Against this backdrop of despair and hardship, Southern Pacific Railroad President Angus D. MacDonald made a bold move. Believing his company could help break the national recession by providing new jobs, he commissioned the design and manufacture of what broadcast commentator John B. Hughes would later call the most beautiful train in the world, the Daylight. The motive power was built at the Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio. Each engine was cast out of a single piece of solid steel. The GS4 steam locomotives and tenders weighed in at over 870,000 pounds. That's 435 tons fully loaded. Coupled together, the engine and tender were slightly more than 110 feet long, 10 feet high, and 15 feet tall. The locomotive put out 78,000 pounds of tractive effort to the drive wheels and was manufactured at a cost of $175,000 each. The wheel arrangement was called a 484. It had four-wheel pilot trucks in front, 8 main drive wheels in the center, and a 4-wheel trailing truck behind the drivers. The 80-inch drive wheels virtually towered over Southern Pacific President Frank Russell Sr. in this 1950s photograph. These 4 GS2 class daylights were photographed shortly after their arrival in Los Angeles. Principally, the trains were intended for passenger service between San Francisco in the north and Los Angeles in the south. In later years, these engines also saw duty between Los Angeles and El Paso and occasionally on feeder lines. But it was the famous coast route between Frisco and LA that daylights were best known for running. From the engine to the parlor observation car, the daylight was painted in uncommonly bright-colored stripes of orange, red, and black. They installed broad, sweeping skirts along both sides of each engine to make them look long and sleek. The passenger cars were fabricated by the Pullman Coach Works in Chicago. From front to back, the daylights were streamlined wonders to behold. But like all good stories, the daylight too had her ending. In 1958, the last engine made her final run. They took off the side skirts and pulled them onto sidings. Diesels had proven to be far more cost-efficient to operate. They required only a third of the labor needed to run and service a steam engine, and fuel consumption was almost cut in half. Out of more than 50 daylight engines, only one GS4 locomotive was saved, designated as engine number 4449. It was donated to the city of Portland, Oregon, where it was put on display in Oaks Park, never to run again. 17 years later, it was America's 200th birthday, the bicentennial. An engine was needed to pull the Freedom Train, so all eyes turned to the forlorn old steam engine in Oaks Park. Weather-beaten and vandalized, it wasn't a very pretty sight. But after tremendous difficulty and a massive restoration effort with hundreds of volunteers, the 4449 was restored, refurbished, and painted red, white, and blue as America's Freedom Train in 1976. Early one spring morning, we were invited to follow the daylight from our home in Portland, Oregon, on a special excursion over the rugged Cascade Mountains and down into the faraway gold country of California, a 500-mile run. Doyle McCormick was the engineer. They lowered the steel railroad bridge over the Willamette River so the daylight could cross to the other side. 2 sharp reports on the whistle was the signal we had waited for. Our long-awaited journey was about to begin.
we said goodbye to Portland and Union Station, ahead lay miles of spectacular Oregon high country. For a younger generation who had never seen a steam engine pull out of the station, the daylight put on a fitting performance. The lead-gray skies and the black steel bridge trusses added to the feeling of mystery that each of us felt, as if we were stepping back in time. The rain clouds had been blown away, and warm sunlight streamed through the windows. There was something indescribably wonderful about riding this train. The clicking of the wheels on the rail, the gentle pitching of the cars had a hypnotic effect. Just around the bend was Oregon City and the Willamette Falls. Geographically, we were traveling south along the banks of the Willamette River. But in railroad geography, we were actually traveling west. There were several cars pacing alongside of the train. We called them the Rat Pack. Doyle McCormick was in constant communication with the Southern Pacific dispatcher. Up and down the line, everyone knew the 4449 was running down the road. Here was a pure picture of contentment. Doyle pointed at the speedometer, and I tried to follow. It read 60, but the way the engine was shaking, it felt like 90. It was like riding out a hurricane inside a Spam can. We were coming into the small town of Jefferson at the Marion County line. We crossed the Jefferson Bridge and then highballed it for Albany.
Well, how about now?
The Daylight and her 11-car consist climbed up the mountainside along the North Fork of the Willamette River. The engine had hit a series of yellow caution signals and had lost its momentum on the steep grade. Up ahead, a downhill Amtrak train was holding on the main line. But now came the first of what would be 23 hard rock tunnels between here and the top of the grade at Cascade Summit. When we came out the other side, watch how the steam rolled off the top of the tunnel ceiling. We were climbing through a tall stand of Douglas fir as the Daylight's exhaust erupted into volcano-sized clouds of vapor. We came out of the cut and approached the rural logging camp of West Fir, Oregon. In the center of town was this beautiful old covered bridge. This was to be our final crossing of the Willamette River. Then came the West Fir Tunnel. On the other side would be the town of Oak Ridge. As the daylight pulled into Oak Ridge, Oregon, there were people all along the trackside. Not just the older generation who remembered steam locomotives, but children too. It was remarkable, in this age of lasers, computers, and high-tech wizardry, that a steam engine, built in 1938, would bring out so many people to watch her huff and chuff her way proudly into the center of town, and into the hearts of those who came to welcome her. In preparation for the steep climb up the snow-capped Cascades, the Southern Pacific Railroad had elected to bring in 2 new helper diesels to pull the daylight over the mountain. We had exceeded the snow line of the Pacific Cascades. Though it was April, the outside temperature was a chilly 26 degrees. Under the shelter of a giant cedar tree, a group of black-tailed deer watched our processional trudge by with little more than passive interest. We had started to clear through a series of black rock tunnels which had been chiseled into the mountain's basalt face. Cold tracks of steel were cantilevered over treacherous, gaping ravines. Rumors were whispered of entire rail cars that pitched over the side into fathomless dark chasms during the Great 64 flood at Noisy Creek. We were intruders in a frozen, windswept no man's land of rock, ice, and snow. The only thing between fate and eternity were the steel wheel flanges that held tightly to the track. Above towered the lofty, windswept peaks of Mount Shasta. This volcanic giant was one of several dormant volcanoes along the Pacific Ring of Fire. And then the daylight, with the 2 diesel helpers, started down into one of the most treacherous pieces of roadbed. This was the top of the Can-Terra Loop. Hundreds of feet below the track lay the Sacramento River. The roadbed clung precariously to the side of the mountain, buttressed from underneath by steel and concrete. At treetop level, we followed the train from the air down into this narrow, high mountain canyon. Over the side, grim reminders that this was a very serious grade. The narrow ribbons of steel descended even deeper into the ravine. At the bottom of the loop, we crossed over the Sacramento, a river we would follow all the way to Shasta Lake Reservoir. The train pulled into Dunsmuir, where the crew serviced the engine. It was an affair that seemingly turned out the entire town. While they serviced the engine, aerial spotter Phil Carville and I took a side trip up the mountain to look at a sharp outthrust of granite rock known as Castle Craigs. This was the Trinity Alps country of the legendary creature known as Bigfoot. And then we continued our journey down the canyon.
If you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling low, remember that I loved you more than you'll ever know. Going where them chilly winds don't blow. I'm leaving in the springtime, won't be back till fall. If I can't forget you, I might not come back at all. Out where them chilly winds don't blow. Out where them chilly winds don't blow. Out where them chilly winds don't blow.
The 4449 Daylight is the only surviving engine of its kind that is still licensed to operate under steam. Thundering down the track with their steel crosshead, changing directions 11 times a second. You're watching a technology engineered by man that for sheer weight and power has no equal. Sadly, the Daylight is now a symbol for the rest of us to look back upon. A treasure left over from the days when steam was beautiful and riding the rails was a way of life. I'm Jim Mitchell. Thank you for watching.